about the geography and the other wildlife as well. So this is where we'll be tomorrow morning, and hopefully we will have a lovely long day there. Hopefully the weather will be kind to us, and after seeing the penguins in their environment down in the Antarctic, this is where you will get to see them in their rookeries with the babies, and hopefully be able to get some good photos of the penguins on land. I always say get close to them, but we don't get too close. There's obviously a lot of regulations about how close we can get, but it should be, hopefully, a good day for you to see the penguins tomorrow. So we just have a little look at the islands here. There's West and East Falkland, and we come into here to Stanley. So we bring the ship into Port William, we put the anchor down, we get the tenders off, the same as we did in Punta Arenas, and we tender into Stanley on the little tender boats. So that's going to be tomorrow morning to get everybody off the ship and into Stanley for the day. And then depending on which excursion you're on, or if you're just going to come down to the closest beach to Stanley, down to York Bay or Gypsy Cove, you can get out, see a little bit of the countryside, or you can just have a day around the town and just have a little bimble about to the shops and do some souvenir shopping for Antarctica, whatever. Fingers crossed we'll all have a good day tomorrow. So here's a few facts about where we're going. There's these two main islands. There's the East and the West Falkland. There's about 776 smaller islands. So you can see all the way around there are these much smaller. Some of the islands are just one farm. So just one family will own that whole island and farm that small island. It is about the size of Connecticut in the USA, about half the size of Wales in the UK. It's about 12,000 square kilometres. Somebody misread that once. They thought it was 12 square kilometres. And when they got there, they said, oh, it seems a lot bigger, doesn't it? But it's 12,000 square kilometres. So it's a big area of land. Now, if you look at somewhere like Connecticut, which is roughly the same size, there's a population there of nearly 4 million. So when we look at the population of the Falklands, there's about 3,662 or so. So it's a tiny population for quite a large area. There's one town here in Stanley. So this is the one town. Now, I was lucky enough to live in the Falklands for a couple of years. I worked down there and lived down there. So that was a real privilege to be part of that community in the Falkland Islands. And this is the only town. So on a Saturday night, there is nowhere else to go. It's Stanley or nothing. So that is pretty much it. There's settlements around the islands, with communities of people in settlements, in farms and small settlements. But Stanley is the only town. So that is where we are going to visit. And Antarctic tourism is obviously quite a big thing here in the Falkland Islands. So in 2020, there were 72,836 people visiting the Falkland Islands. So if you compare that to the population, you can see how much when we come in a big cruise ship, we really sort of double the population on that day. There were, in 2023, there were 100,000 tourists going to Antarctica and 122,000 tourists going to the Falkland Islands. So it's pretty much the same who visit Antarctica. So most of the people that go to the islands are on an Antarctic cruise ship, and it's a stop-off point. There's also the cruises that go around South America that stop off on the islands as well. So the numbers are kind of quite high now. They're going up, and you can see the difference in the number of visitors to the number of people that live there. And here we are, just to kind of orientate ourselves. We're down here, the bottom in the South Atlantic. We've crossed over the Drake Passage to the Antarctic Peninsula. We're crossing back, and then we'll stop off on the way before we go up to Montevideo. So we're 300 miles from the coast of South America. The climate is kind of temperate maritime climate. So very different to what we've been experiencing on the other side of the convergence in the Antarctic. So it's temperate maritime. There are constant low pressure weather systems. It's kind of similar to the northeast of Scotland. So it's wet weather. A lot of this maritime weather, wet weather coming up across the South Atlantic, but it's not extreme weather. And the islands sit in a cold water current that comes up here, up from the south and around Cape Horn. And this is something called the Falkland Island Midwinter Swim, which I was lucky enough, I don't know if lucky is the right word, but I did this for 2 years. So not midsummer, this is midwinter. And it's always been quite a big event on the social calendar on the islands, with a bonfire on the beach. No wetsuits, you have to run in, duck your head under, run back out again. It's one of those, there's not, this is kind of a big event on the social calendar, not that much else sometimes. So you kind of make your own fun, don't you, in these situations? And cold water swimming is also quite important in the Antarctic and some of the bases, so it kind of carries on that idea of these cold water places. So you might think it is not the best place in the world for a beach holiday. You may not go there to go swimming, but it is a brilliant place for the penguins, which is what we were going to talk about. The penguins rely on this cold water. They don't mind swimming in there. To them, this is perfect conditions. So the cold water doesn't bother the penguins at all. It is great for wildlife. So there is far more oxygen dissolved in cold water. There's more nutrients down here. So the cold water is where it is at for the wildlife. When you go to the tropical places with the warm, clear blue waters, there's not so much oxygen in the water. It doesn't support so much life. So down here in the South Atlantic, this is the place for the penguins. And you can see here, this is a satellite image of an algal bloom in the South Atlantic. So this is in the spring when the sun comes back, lots of energy from the sun, there's the nutrients in the water, there's the oxygen water, and that is where you get the start of the food chain. So you get this green algae, the phytoplankton that lives all across the South Atlantic, and that attracts all the animals down here. And one of the things that attracts are these giant krill, which they're not that big, trust me, they're tiny little things. But they feed on the green algae, and they are the star of the show. So that's what starts off the food chain, and that is why you have so much wildlife around the Falkland Islands because of that. And as we talked about this morning, the whales come to feed as well. So we saw the whales in Antarctica, where they're feeding in the bays. So they're attracted down to the Antarctic, where there's incredible rich blooms of krill and fish. In the Falklands, they do come here to feed. Some of them are passing through on migration, but they are good islands to spot whales as we're coming into the islands, as we're leaving. Keep your eyes open for all sorts of species of whales around the Falkland Islands. And the seals, the penguins, and the seabirds, they all use the Falklands as a breeding site to raise their young. So these are islands in the middle of the South Atlantic, and the penguins come here because they can feed offshore, and then they can raise their young, their chicks, on the islands. And another defining feature of the islands is the wind. So if you see here, there is no land mass at all that blocks the wind. So the wind roars around the Antarctic continent, the furious 50s, they roar around here, and here's the Falkland Islands. So the islands are very windy. And they're on the edge of like the windiest region on Earth. The wind funnels between Cape Horn here and Antarctica. So here's the 50-degree line, and it's often called the furious 50s because the wind kind of whistles around across the island. Now, after saying all this, sometimes we get there and it will be like a flat, calm day and there's no wind at all, and you think, what on earth was she talking about? But I promise me, usually the wind is quite a big part of life in the islands. And there's some of the worst seas in the world. We saw when we got close to the Antarctic Peninsula, we had a day when it was really windy. I don't know if you've blocked that out of your memories, but we had some real strong winds down there. So you can see in this whole part of the world, that's quite a big part of life. Not so great for us, maybe, but for these guys, for the albatross, this is where they live. They need the wind. They don't flap their wings, they lock their wings. So they don't use energy. They can soar around the Southern Ocean, around Antarctica, maybe for 5-6 years without landing, just living out there in the Drake Passage in the Southern Ocean around the continent. So it's wonderful to see these as we come into the islands. These often kind of herald us into the islands. They'll be around the ship, and about 80% of the world's population of black-browed albatross breed on the islands. So they're a very important place for wildlife, and in particular these beautiful, beautiful albatross that we've been seeing around the ship. And the albatross rely on the ocean for their feed. You may have seen them around the ship if they kind of scoop the food up from the surface. They'll eat fish, squid, crustaceans, and then they'll bring that food back to their chick on the nest, which is nesting on little rocky cliffs, largely around the west of the islands. And this is what a lot of the islands look like. It is treeless moorland, which is due to the wind, and the wind has blown a lot of the soil away. So there's fairly poor soil and a sort of a treeless landscape, which to me is beautiful. It's a wilderness, it's quite wild, but this is what most of the islands look like. And most of the vegetation is kind of dwarf vegetation that has to hide down in the rocks away from the wind. This particular plant here is called balsam bog. So you may see this growing around Stanley. It's very common. It looks soft, but it's rock hard to the touch. So it's almost like a rock, and it's adapted to survive in the extreme conditions on the island. You may see this. This is a diddle dee. And it's kind of a bitter berry, so you wouldn't want to eat it straight off, but you can make jam from the diddle dee. So there's this kind of dwarf vegetation, quite beautiful, growing all around Stanley, all around the island. So look out for diddle dee jam. So I'd recommend that. That's a nice thing to take home with you. And my favourite plant, not only here but up in Scotland, is the gorse. It's so beautiful. It will grow everywhere, all over the islands. It's introduced to the islands, but it's around the settlements, around Stanley, and there's usually some flowers somewhere. So it's usually gorse is in flower somewhere around the islands, and when the sun hits the gorse, it's a beautiful smell. I think we're kind of looking forward to this after being in the Antarctic, where everything's been white, the same colours. I think we're kind of craving the flowers and the greenery. So I think when we get there tomorrow, it's going to be a different experience if we'd come there from somewhere else where there's plenty of trees and vegetation. I think to us it's going to look like a haven of wonderful sort of green scenery and plants and flowers. And you can see how the gorse grows around the settlements all around the islands. This is one of the islands out on the west. This is Carcass Island, and you can see some of the introduced species of trees that have been planted to provide windbreak. So although there's no native trees on the islands, but there are trees that have been introduced and planted to break the wind around the farms. There's Scots pine, which are planted around the settlement here, gorse hedge, which is spread out over the years, moorland vegetation. The farmhouse here was built in 1938, so it's surrounded by trees, and there's beautiful views here across the bay, penguins on the beach, usually dolphins in the bay here. This is Carcass Island, one of the small islands out on the west. And the species were usually introduced by sheep farmers, sheep shearers from Scotland, maybe from the West Country in England, from New Zealand, and they built the farms and planted the trees and the gorse around the farmstead. So as I said, beautiful, beautiful places to visit. We won't get a chance to go out to the west, but if you decided to come back, you might choose to come and see some of the west of the islands as well. This is Valley Cottage, 120 years old little cottage. It's part of the settlement. And you can see the New Zealand palm trees, which you'll see around Stanley as well, that have been planted. This when I was living on the islands, this was a holiday cottage that you could go out and stay, get away from the hustle and bustle of Stanley, all the bright lights of Stanley. Just get away, have a little break from it all. And the gardens are beautiful, absolutely beautiful, all over Stanley, all over the islands. Lupins, fuchsias, roses, so the islands really do bloom. It's as long as you can stop that wind and make kind of a little microclimate, you can grow pretty much anything. So this island in particular, Carcass Island, is 6 miles by 2 miles. The main industry is sheep farming and tourism. So when I was living there, the cruise ships would come into the bay, and you'd open the cupboards in the kitchen and there'd be hundreds of teacups and plates and things like that for when the cruise ships came in to make tea and smoko, like snacks for the people coming to visit. So that's a little taste of what's over on the west of the islands, on one of the little islands. When we come into the islands, you'll see these features. Now, this is a plant that grows on something called a stone run. Oh. And this is a snake plant. And you wouldn't believe the lengths that we went to photograph this plant, walking all over for days to find this. It's a very unusual plant. Charles Darwin visited the Falklands in 1834. So you remember when we went through all the fjords in Chile, and we went down the Beagle Channel and we saw the Darwin range of mountains. So Charles Darwin was down here on the second voyage of the Beagle, and he spent a fair bit of time in the Falkland Islands. There's his diaries that he wrote all about his time in the islands, and this plant was identified by him. It only grows in the Falklands, and it only grows on the stone runs. So it's a very, very specific plant. And all these things helped Charles Darwin think about evolution and adaptation of plants and animals to different locations. So there's some wonderful vegetation down there in the island. And this is what the stone runs look like. So as we come into the islands, you'll see these coming down the sides of the hills. They're a very unusual feature. They're kind of a distinctive feature of the islands. The stones don't move, the rocks don't move, they're fixed in position, and they're from something called freeze-thaw action on these specific rocks, the quartzite rocks. They can be between about 40 metres to 4 kilometres wide, and they're a relic from the last ice age. So they almost look like glaciers. We've seen so many glaciers over the last few days, but these are made of rock, of quartzite rock. And there's all sorts of stone runs around Stanley, some quite famous ones that you might see if you're out on a day trip or from Stanley. And they're sometimes called stone rivers. This is another one round the back of Stanley. As I said, the rocks don't move, they're kind of fixed there. And they're also mentioned by Charles Darwin in his diaries when he came to visit. So look out for those, they're kind of interesting, and you might want to find out a bit more about them after you visit. Now, a little bit about the geology of the islands then. From the stone runs, you can see that the geology of the Falkland Islands is quite diverse, it's quite different. This is the West Falkland, this is East Falkland, and there's quite a difference between the two. The dark purple are the oldest rocks, so these are the ancient, very hard quartzite rock, and they're found up here above Stanley on the east, and over here on the west of the island. Some of these rocks are 1 billion years old, and they will come from when the Falklands was part of the ancient supercontinent called Gondwana land, and that drifted down here. So we've got some ancient rocks down in the Falkland Islands. And the quartzite rocks, the hard rocks, form these steep rocky cliffs around the west. And they're perfect locations for the seabirds, for the nesting seabirds. Down here on Lafonia, you'll see there's different geology. This is more recent rock. This is the green sandstone. So this whole area here is made of very recent young sandstone rock compared to the ancient rocks around there. Now, the reason we're kind of looking at that is because it explains the difference in topography on the islands. Down here, we've got flat grassland, lots of farmland, and around the other islands, you'll have the steep rocky cliffs, which is for the albatross and some of the penguins that nest there as well. So we've got the hard quartzite rocks forming the rocky cliffs, and the recent sandstone and mudstone in Lafonia down here, which forms the flat grassland and the sheep and the cattle farming country. This is mainly where Charles Darwin visited, around in the kind of the flat grassland areas around there. And you can see the difference. So on East Falkland we have a lot of low-lying grassland, often fringed with beautiful sandy beaches. So you may be visiting some of those with the big penguin colonies on the big sandy beaches. And then over on the west we have a lot of this rocky coastline, cliffs maybe 100, 200 metres high, that are perfect for the nesting seabirds, for the albatross, because they can go straight out into the ocean. So it's quite a different landscape between the two. And also you could notice the weather, which is fairly characteristic. Over on the east, it can be cloudy or grey, whereas over on the west you often get the sunshine. So the islanders often say that west is the best. That they're both sides have got good things to them. So you can see there's the east and the west of the islands. This is over on the west. This is Saunders Island. And you can actually stay in a little sort of porter cabin up here on Saunders Island, and there's a beautiful beach down here called the Neck. So this is one of the wonderful places to visit on the islands. When the weather's good, I can say that. When the weather's good, it is the most beautiful place in the world, called God's own country. It's absolutely wonderful. When the weather's bad, it's maybe, you want to shelter and get away from it. So it's one of those kind of places. But this is Saunders Island on a beautiful clear day, and that was me a few years ago when I was living there. You sit on the beach and it's like white sand, blue sea, and you're thinking, oh, this is heaven. And then you look behind you and the penguins have kind of crept up on you. And you remember that the next step down is Antarctica, and this sea is absolutely freezing cold. But you can swim there. So it's a beautiful place to visit. The wildlife is curious. It does want to come up to you and check you out, but it's important for us that we keep our distance, especially with things like bird flu. We do need to keep away, but it's a lovely place to chill out and enjoy the beach life with our little friends, the penguins. So here we are. This is the Gentoo penguin. So these are the ones on the beach that you've just seen. These are the same penguins that we saw at Port Lockroy. So if you heard the people from Port Lockroy talking about the penguins, these are the ones that will do the pebbling. They steal the penguins from each other. There's not very much material for making nests because there's no trees, and then pebbles are really important currency to them. So they'll steal a penguin from somebody else, and then while they're doing that, somebody's stolen a penguin from their nest, and it kind of goes round and round and round. So lovely penguins. This penguin is beautiful and clean, as you can see. He's just been in the sea, so he's very clean, but after a little while in the penguin colony, they do get covered in muck. It's pretty, there's a lot of poo going around. I think they talked about that at Port Lockroy, didn't they? The smell is very strong. We can't get that from the thing, but wonderful creatures to watch. One of the best things is to sit and watch a penguin colony. You forget everything else. They're kind of fascinating little creatures to be part of their world for a short time is lovely. The penguins outnumber people by about 300 to 1 on the islands, and that is my kind of place. I think that is wonderful to have way more penguins than people. And as we've seen in the Antarctic, they have this distinctive white bar. They've got matching orange bill and feet, which is very suave and sophisticated, I think. Silver white underparts, not underpants, underparts. And they're less than a metre tall. They live to about 15 years old. They're very inquisitive, very nervous. They're kind of great explorers, so you will see them climbing up the hills. Even in Antarctica, they will climb up and try and explore and find new places. And they'll often nest about 3 miles inland, so they'll have to do that journey to go out to sea and back again. And the Falklands have the largest breeding colonies in the world, so this is the place to see the penguins as close as you can. They are opportunist feeders, I don't think we've said that there, so they forage fairly close inshore, all the penguins in the Falklands, and they keep within about 20 kilometres of the island, so they're fairly close inshore. They have quite a variety of prey. They'll eat lobsters, krill, crustaceans, squid, fish, anything that they can take. The penguins kind of divide the ocean up in layers, in depths, and they'll feed at different layers so that they all get a chance to feed. The gentoos aren't in decline. They're not necessarily threatened species at the moment, but they are being affected by bird flu. And as you've probably already heard, the beach that we visit close to Stanley, York Bay and Gypsy Cove, was affected by bird flu in October. So they've had quite a big, most of the chicks didn't survive early on in the season, so they had to close that area around Stanley. So these poor old chaps are being affected by bird flu, which means we need to, or avian flu, so we need to be very careful when we're around the colonies. These are the king penguins, so these are the slightly larger Falkland Island penguins. There's 5 species that we see there. So there's the gentoos, the kings. These are nearly a metre tall, so these are the taller penguins, and they're very beautiful compared to the gentoos. They're very calm. As you can see, they like to pose for the camera. They put their feet up like this. They have to thermoregulate. They have to keep their body temperature at the right temperature, so there's a lot of trying to lose heat or keep heat in, but they'll rest on their tails with these big leathery feet that they flap up like that. So if you see the king penguins, look at their feet for a little bit. They're quite wonderful to be able to see penguin feet up close. But they're probably the most beautiful of the Falkland penguins. And as I said, they do pose. They do like to pose for the cameras. They make a wonderful noise. If you're with the colony, you'll hear them making these kind of clacking noises. So I hope you get to see some of these as well tomorrow. And my favourite out of the Falkland penguins are the rock hoppers. They're the smallest Falkland penguin, but I think they've got the biggest personality. You can make up your own mind with these, but these are my favourites. They're very charismatic. They are the most interesting to watch. You can sit by a rock hopper colony and watch them all day, coming up the cliffs, coming back to the nest, having little squabbles, things like that. They're funny, they're friendly, they're full of character, and there's always something going on in a rock hopper colony, so I hope you get a chance to see some of these as well. You may have seen them on television documentaries. They hop on both feet. They'll hop from rock to rock. They have to come in from the sea, often from the wild sea, back on land, and you'll see them kind of scrabbling up the rocks and then getting washed back out again and coming back in. So, I mean, incredible that they're able to raise their chicks against all the odds like that, going back out to sea to forage, then coming back into their nesting site. The penguins will all go off at the end of the breeding season. They'll all go off into the open ocean, and then at breeding time next season, they will all come back in again. Around about October, they'll come back in. They come back to their same nest, and they'll wait there for their partner to come back. So most of these will mate for life and go off during the non-breeding season, come back, get together again when they're breeding. So they're wonderful, wonderful to see them. And you can see they've got this like yellow little tufty eyebrows above their eyes, these yellow plumes and these little red beady eyes. They're always up to something. And about 40% of the world's population breed in the Falkland Islands. I always think this is like the first, second and third winners of the rock hopping competition. They really are the best of the best, I think, the rock hopper penguins. So there are colonies around Stanley, so you may be able to see those. They live to about 15 years old. They lay 1 egg. Both parents incubate them. The male broods the chick and the female goes out hunting for food. And sadly, these ones are a bit more vulnerable to climate change and overfishing. So some of the rock hoppers are being, their populations are more vulnerable than the gentoos or the kings, for example. And there have been drastic declines in recent years, especially with some sort of extreme weather. They can suffer quite badly from that. And then the next species that we are hoping to see on the islands are the Magellanic penguins. So these are the ones we saw around Punta Arenas. These are the ones we see in South America. We don't see them in the Antarctic, but we see them again when we come back up to the Falkland Islands. The local name is the jackass because they make a sound like a donkey braying, which is kind of the sound of the Falkland summer, this loud braying sound of all the jackass penguins as they're coming in the evening. So they're wonderful to see them, wonderful to hear them. They are very shy. To me, you would just always have the feeling that they are very, very shy penguins, way more than the rockhoppers, the kings, or the gentoos on the island. And you need to be really careful when you're around these colonies. If they've been feeding out to sea, that is all their energy gone. They've found some food, they've got that food ready to give to their chick, and if they get disturbed as they're coming in, they'll regurgitate the food up, and that's the food from that whole day for the baby penguins. So we do need to be careful around the Magellanics. They burrow underground. So that's the extraordinary thing about these, a bit like the fairy penguins. I think they make a burrow underground, and you'll see the little penguin chicks in the burrows underground and the kind of the sandy areas around the beach. And they make these kind of little caves where the chick grows up, and then they go out to sea, bring the food back into the little cave underground to feed the chicks. So quite extraordinary life cycle, and the extent they go to raise that tiny chick and get them to fledge and go out to sea is quite extraordinary. The things the parents do to make sure that the penguins carry on. And again, these will mate for life. They'll be together in the breeding season, then they go off into the oceans separately, and then they'll come back to the same burrow, get back together again, and raise the chick again in the spring. And the general rule with the penguins is to keep about 6 metres, 20 feet away, and never walk through the colony, even though it may seem quite okay to do so. The burrows are on sandy soil, so they can collapse, and you could, as I said, you could frighten the penguin and they bring up all the food which they've spent all day trying to find. 10% of the world's population of these lives in the Falkland Islands, and there's a big decline in numbers at the moment. They are sensitive to overfishing and climate change, so these guys need a help as well out of a lot of the other species that we've seen. So we need to sort of keep our eyes on these as well. They're great travellers. You do find them in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. There's different types of them all around the world. So these are probably the most common out of all the ones we've seen. And then if you're lucky, you might see one of these. These are macaronis. They've got the yellow feathers like a little hat, like a fancy little feather hat. And they were named by the English sailors in the 18th centuries, because at the time, anyone that went to Italy and was a bit fancy and wore yellow feathers in their hats, or wore a hat with feathers, the nickname was a macaroni. So this is why these were nicknamed macaroni penguins. And not that many breed on the islands, but you may be lucky. You sometimes find a few of them with the rock hoppers. So keep an eye out for these little chaps as well, the rock hoppers. They don't have the yellow eyebrows, they have the yellow feather hat, and they're a little bit bigger, more chunky than the rock hoppers as well. Again, these are sensitive to overfishing and climate change. So here we are, all the breeding penguins. They all arrive on the islands in September to nest. They raise their young, and then they leave in April. So we're here, December, January, perfect time to visit, because the chicks will be there, there'll be eggs on the nest, and the mums and the dads are there, they're out foraging and coming back. So we're visiting the absolute perfect time. Now, just move along from the penguins just for a minute and have a quick look at the albatross. As I said, these rocky cliffs form the perfect runways for the albatross. As the birds go out to feed, to sea, they go down kind of these runways out to the open sea from the nests. And when the baby albatross chicks fledge, they've got a runway. They can take off into the wind and go straight out to sea. The parents mate for life. I love these. Are beautiful black-browed albatross on the islands. They mate for life. They will be off around the oceans, come back together to the same nest in September. They lay a single egg in October. It hatches in December, fledges in April. And we're here right at the perfect time to see these albatross. About 80% of the world's population breeds in the Falklands. They start to breed about age 7, and they continue until about age 35. So these pairs will be together all that time. And they can live for probably about possibly 70 years. The data's not exactly clear, but these are long-lived birds, like the wandering albatross. These are medium-sized albatross. They're not as big. Remember, the wandering albatross are about 12 feet. These are about 2.5 metre wingspan, so they're big wingspans, but not quite as big as the wanderers. And this is a chick on the nest with her mum or dad sitting there looking out. So you see these big fluffy chicks that are being fed by the parents, and they'll lose their feathers, lose their little fluffy feathers, and they'll fledge, and then they'll take off into the open ocean, and they may circle the islands, circle the Southern Ocean for 5 or 6 years until they're ready to come in and breed as well. So just a quick look at some of the other birds. So we've had the penguins, the albatross. This is a striated caracara. So this is one of the rarest birds of prey in the world, but these are common on the island, so you may well see these during your visit. They often breed around the penguin colonies or the albatross colonies. They're scavengers, so they feed on carrion, but they may take weak lambs as well on the sheep farms. They kind of steal anything. They'll come and take anything that's red. They follow you and peck at you, and they take anything they can. So they've got a big character. The local name is the Johnny Rook. They're very intelligent birds of prey, and they've kind of worked out a way to live with people. So they've worked out a way to live on the farms and live around Stanley. So you may just see these as striated caracaras. As we come into the islands, there are usually some seals around. We usually have the sea lions. They're preying on the penguins, but they're quite often in Stanley around where we come in. You probably won't see these. These are the leopard seals. It's pretty scary, but they will also be preying on the penguins in the penguin colonies. So keep your eyes open for the leopard seals, for the sea lions, definitely around Stanley, and just be wary of them. They're very wary of people, but we need to be wary of them. They could give you a very nasty nip if you got too close to those. But hopefully we'll see definitely the sea lions as we come in. The elephant seals they're my favourite seal. I think everybody should have a favourite seal, and the elephants are mine. They're kind of funny looking, they're grumpy, they're smelly, they're bad-tempered. The males are huge. The male elephant seals can be about 5 metres long, and they only come onto land to breed. So the rest of the time they are in the open ocean. They come on to molt their skin, to kind of scratch off the skin, and they come onto land to breed. They're 80% of their lives in the ocean, 90% of their time underwater, and they only come up just to breathe for a few minutes, and then they're back down underwater again. And they can hold their breath for about 100 minutes. They can dive down to about 1.5 kilometres, but the deepest recorded dive is nearly 2.5 kilometres. So these are animals that really live in a completely different world to us. They live right down there in the deep all the time. You can see here there's a little tussock bird down here, if you can see on the kelp, and they annoy the hell out of the elephant seals because they are always pecking them as they're on the beach molting, and the elephant seals can get quite cross about these little tussock birds who keep pecking them all the time. Beautiful, incredible, fascinating creatures, and it's kind of heartbreaking to think that at the end of the 19th century the elephant seals were hunted almost to extinction. So all around the islands, all around the South Shetlands, Elephant Island, Falkland Islands, all these islands, we hunted the elephant seals because they've got this thick layer of blubber. The same with the whales, this thick layer of fat that we used before we had fossil fuels. So we used that as a fuel all the way up until we discovered oil. We used the blubber from the seals and the whales. So along with the other seals, with the penguins and the whales, that sort of went on all over the Falkland Islands and on the other islands. And these penguins here, this Gentoo colony, they're actually on top of an old place where they were boiling down the bones of the seals and the penguins, and now they've made their colony there. So it's kind of great that all the numbers are coming back again. And there was the whaling. This was a whaling station on the Falkland Islands, on New Ireland, and that was later moved down to South Georgia. So the Falklands were used as a base for hunting the southern right whales from about the 1770s onwards. And the native vegetation, as I said, there's no native trees, but there is this stuff called tussock grass. And this is what all the islands were fringed in. So a lot of the wildlife lived underneath the tussock grass, but that was used for the farming, that was used as fodder, it was burnt, and most of the tussock grass was removed, and there's only about 20% of the original range left. So look out for the tussock grass. As you can see, this is how things used to be in the Falkland Island before a lot of the tussock was removed, and the penguins would live underneath the tussock, and you had like a microclimate under there, so there was nesting sites, there were invertebrates, it kept everything out of the wind. And the good thing is that in the islands, through conservation efforts, a lot of the tussock is being replanted, so you're having lots more areas of tussock being replanted back in the islands. So just to finish off then, just the last couple of minutes, things to look out for as we come into the islands, badly out of focus, but these are the penguins porpoising in the water. So we're all quite good at spotting penguins now in the water, and as we come into Stanley, you will see lots of penguins around the ship porpoising in the water, and as we leave the islands as well, and as we come in on the tenders. So keep your eyes open for our little chubby friends, the penguins, as we come in. And also the dolphins and the porpoises. There's Commerson's dolphins, Peel's porpoises. They're quite rare in many other places, but they're fairly common down there on the islands, and they will often accompany the tenders into Stanley. You may well see these. These are Falkland flightless steamer ducks. So these don't fly, they're ducks, they don't fly, they kind of steam along in the water using their little wings. So look out for these in the harbour as well, they're quite beautiful to see. And as I mentioned these before, the giant petrels, the local name is the stinker. They kind of regurgitate an oily, stinky fluid if you get too close to them. So that's what earned them the name stinker. And you will often see them soaring along the harbour or along the edge of the coast as we come into the island. So look out for the stinkers. The dolphin gulls, again, in South America, you get them around towns. They live quite happily with people, but they're wonderful to see with their bright orange feet and bright bill. Skuas are kind of like opportunist scavengers that you may see around Stanley. And the night herons that live in the harbour. The local name is the quark. So there's often night herons just in the part of Stanley where we come and visit. So yeah, all little things to look out for as we're in Stanley. There's wildlife kind of all around you if you just take a few minutes and look. And I hope you get some good views of the penguins when we're there. I hope we have a good day weather-wise, because that always helps as well. This is in the town. This is the school where I worked, where I lived there, so you could walk down and have a look at the school. There's lots of things to look at in the town. And just kind of remember that the islands are completely off the beaten track. Very, very few people visit there. It's not an easy place to visit otherwise. So often it's people on cruise ships in the summer that get to go there. So it's quite a privilege for us to go and experience a day on the islands. They're a haven for wildlife, so let's hope we have some good weather. We often have 4 seasons in one day, so even if it's a bit cloudy or rainy, quite often it will clear up later on. So fingers crossed. Don't forget to take your waterproofs, lots of layers, and have a really, really lovely day off the ship. Hooray! Okay, thank you very much. Have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.